Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The autumn of 1867 brought an unusual chill to the hills surrounding Blackwood, Massachusetts, a settlement so remote that even the most detailed maps of the Commonwealth often omitted its existence. It was here, in this forgotten corner of New England, that Dr. Ezra Whitmore first encountered the case that would consume the remainder of his distinguished career and ultimately drive him to abandon the medical profession entirely. Dr. Whitmore had arrived in Blackwood at the behest of the Massachusetts Board of Health, following reports of peculiar ailments affecting the local population. The town's only physician, now Dr. Samuel Hartwell, had sent increasingly desperate correspondence to Boston, describing symptoms that defied conventional medical understanding. What began as a routine consultation would evolve into something far more sinister. The Caldwell family resided in a weathered colonial house on the outskirts of town, where the forest pressed close against civilization, like a dark tide held temporarily at bay. Jeremiah Caldwell, a man of modest means who earned his living as a carpenter, had written to Dr. Hartwell concerning his youngest son, Timothy, age 7. The boy, according to his father's account, had begun exhibiting behaviors that troubled the entire household. Dr. Whitmore's journal, discovered decades later in the archives of the Boston Medical Library, provides our primary source for understanding the events that followed. His initial entry, dated October 15, 1867, describes his first meeting with the Caldwell family in clinical yet increasingly unsettled terms. The physician found Timothy to be a child of unremarkable appearance, slight of build, with pale skin common to New England youth and dark hair that fell across intelligent brown eyes. Yet something in the boy's demeanor immediately struck Dr. Whitmore as profoundly unsettling. Timothy possessed a stillness that seemed unnatural in one so young, a quality of watchful patience that belonged more to ancient things than to children. Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell, a woman worn thin by years of frontier life and recent worry, recounted the beginning of her son's strange condition. It had commenced, she explained, following a fever that had gripped Timothy for 3 days in late August. The fever itself had not been severe by frontier standards, but when it broke, the child who emerged seemed fundamentally altered. The changes were subtle at first. Timothy had always been a quiet child, but his silence now carried an almost oppressive weight. He would sit for hours without movement, his gaze fixed on empty corners of rooms or directed toward the forest beyond their windows. When addressed, he would respond appropriately, yet his words carried an odd formality, as though he were carefully translating thoughts from some foreign language. More disturbing still were the incidents that occurred during the night hours. The family reported being awakened by the sound of Timothy's footsteps in the hallway, only to find the boy standing motionless in the darkness, facing their bedroom door. When questioned, he would claim no memory of leaving his bed, returning to his room with the same eerie compliance that marked all his actions. Dr. Whitmore's examination revealed nothing abnormal in Timothy's physical condition. The boy's pulse remained steady, his reflexes normal, his responses to standard medical tests entirely within expected parameters. Yet the physician found himself increasingly uncomfortable in the child's presence, noting in his journal a sensation he described as being observed by something wearing the guise of innocence. The local population had begun to whisper about the Caldwell boy, though their concerns remained largely unspoken in the presence of the family. Blackwood was a community where superstition and pragmatism existed in uneasy balance, where the harsh realities of frontier life left little room for fanciful notions, yet where the proximity of untamed wilderness made certain possibilities seem less impossible than they might in more civilized regions. Dr. Hartwell confided to his colleague that several families had reported similar disturbances coinciding with Timothy's condition. children waking in the night, claiming to have seen a pale figure standing in their yards, livestock behaving strangely, clustering together in corners of their enclosures as though seeking protection from some unseen threat. These reports, while lacking in concrete evidence, created an atmosphere of growing unease throughout the settlement. As October deepened and the forest around Blackwood blazed with autumn colors that seemed almost violent in their intensity, Dr. Whitmore found himself drawn repeatedly to the Caldwell household. His medical training demanded rational explanations, yet each visit left him with more questions than answers. Timothy's condition showed no signs of improvement, and indeed seemed to be evolving in ways that challenged the very foundations of medical understanding. The physician's final entry for this period notes his decision to remain in Blackwood indefinitely, abandoning his planned return to Boston. Something in the boy's case had captured his attention completely, though he struggled to articulate precisely what that something might be. The last line of his October journal reads simply, "I fear we are dealing with something that science has yet to acknowledge, much less explain." November arrived with an early snowfall that blanketed Blackwood in an unnatural silence, as though the very earth sought to muffle whatever secrets lay beneath its surface. Dr. Whitmore had established temporary residence in the town's modest inn, transforming his cramped quarters into an impromptu laboratory where he could document his increasingly troubling observations of Timothy Caldwell. The physician's methodology remained rigorous despite the unconventional nature of his subject. Each day, he would arrive at the Caldwell residence at precisely 9 o'clock in the morning, carrying his leather medical bag and a worn notebook that grew thicker with detailed entries. His approach combined traditional medical examination with careful behavioral observation, though he found himself venturing into territories that no medical school had prepared him to navigate. Timothy's daily routine had crystallized into patterns that defied normal childhood behavior. The boy would wake before dawn, sitting upright in his bed with perfect posture until his mother came to dress him. He consumed his meals with mechanical precision, never requesting seconds nor leaving food unfinished. His movements throughout the day followed invisible schedules that seemed to operate independently of any external stimulus or family routine. Most disturbing to Dr. Whitmore was Timothy's relationship with the surrounding forest. The child would position himself at windows facing the tree line, maintaining vigil for hours without apparent fatigue or boredom. When questioned about his fascination with the woods, Timothy would respond with statements that chilled the physician. "They are waiting," or "the trees remember everything." These utterances, delivered in the boy's unnaturally calm voice, carried implications that Dr. Whitmore found increasingly difficult to dismiss as childhood imagination. The doctor's attempts to engage Timothy in conventional activities met with limited success. The boy would comply with requests to read, write, or perform simple tasks, but his execution lacked the spontaneity and imperfection typical of children his age. His penmanship was unnaturally precise, his reading pronunciation flawless, as though he were performing rather than learning. When presented with toys or games, Timothy would examine them with the detached curiosity of a scholar studying foreign artifacts. Dr. Hartwell shared his colleague's growing concern, though he approached the case from a different perspective. The local physician had begun documenting what he termed sympathetic disturbances throughout Blackwood. Several other children in the community had developed sleep disorders, waking their families with reports of dreams featuring a pale boy who spoke in whispers. Adults complained of persistent feelings of being watched, particularly when venturing near the forest's edge. The Caldwell family itself showed signs of strain that extended beyond normal parental worry. Jeremiah had grown increasingly withdrawn, spending long hours in his workshop crafting furniture with obsessive attention to detail, as though seeking refuge in the familiar rhythm of his trade. Eleanor had developed a nervous habit of checking and rechecking the locks on their doors and windows, despite Blackwood's reputation as a community where such precautions were rarely necessary. Most troubling were the changes in Timothy's older siblings. His sister Margaret, aged 12, had begun experiencing episodes of what her parents described as waking sleep. Periods where she would stand motionless in the middle of conversations, her eyes open but unseeing, before resuming normal behavior with no memory of the interruption. His brother James, aged 10, had developed an intense aversion to darkness, refusing to enter any room without adequate lighting and claiming that shadows moved independently of their sources. Dr. Whitmore's medical examinations of the family revealed no physical abnormalities that might explain these phenomena. Blood samples appeared normal under microscopic analysis. Pulse rates remained within expected ranges, and standard neurological tests yielded unremarkable results. Yet the physician found himself documenting symptoms that had no place in any medical textbook he had studied. The boys' nocturnal activities had escalated beyond simple wandering. The family reported finding Timothy in impossible locations, standing in the center of rooms with no clear path of entry, or discovered outside despite all doors and windows remaining securely locked. When confronted with these incidents, Timothy would offer no explanation, returning to his bed with the same unsettling compliance that characterized all his actions. Local wildlife had begun exhibiting unusual behaviors that seemed to correlate with Timothy's condition. Birds avoided the area around the Caldwell house, creating a zone of unnatural quiet that extended roughly 50 yards in all directions. Domestic animals showed signs of extreme agitation when brought near the property, and several hunting dogs had refused to track game that led toward the Caldwell land. Dr. Whitmore's journal entries from this period reveal a man struggling to maintain scientific objectivity while confronting phenomena that challenged his fundamental understanding of reality. His notes became increasingly detailed, as though precise documentation might somehow render the inexplicable comprehensible. Yet with each passing day, the physician found himself drawn deeper into a mystery that seemed to expand rather than resolve under scrutiny. The month's final entry in Dr. Whitmore's journal contains a single haunting observation. The boy is not ill in any conventional sense. Rather, he appears to be becoming something else entirely, and I fear that his transformation is somehow contagious. December's arrival brought with it a harsh winter that seemed to settle over Blackwood like a physical presence, transforming the already isolated community into something resembling a snow-bound prison. Dr. Whitmore's investigation had entered its third month, and the physician found himself documenting phenomena that challenged not only medical understanding, but the very nature of reality itself. The manifestations, as Dr. Whitmore had begun to classify them in his increasingly cryptic journal entries, had evolved beyond Timothy's immediate household. The boy's influence, for lack of a more scientific term, appeared to radiate outward from the Caldwell residence in concentric circles of disturbance that affected both human and animal populations with disturbing consistency. Timothy himself had undergone subtle but unmistakable changes during the winter months. His pale complexion had acquired an almost translucent quality, as though his skin had become a thin membrane barely containing something that sought to emerge. His movements, already unnaturally precise, had developed a flowing quality that reminded Dr. Whitmore of water moving through underground channels, purposeful yet following laws that remained hidden from observation. The boy's speech patterns had evolved as well, becoming increasingly formal and archaic in structure. He would address adults with phrases that seemed drawn from an earlier century, speaking of obligations and preparations, in contexts that made no apparent sense. When questioned about these statements, Timothy would regard his interrogator with eyes that seemed far older than his 7 years, offering explanations that only deepened the mystery surrounding his condition. Dr. Hartwell had documented 17 cases of what he termed sympathetic affliction among Blackwood's population. Children throughout the community had begun exhibiting behaviors that mirrored Timothy's condition in diluted form, periods of unnatural stillness, an obsessive focus on the surrounding forest, and sleep disturbances that left entire families exhausted and on edge. Adults reported persistent sensations of being observed, particularly during the twilight hours when shadows grew long and the boundary between day and night became indistinct. The physician's attempts to establish communication with Timothy had yielded increasingly disturbing results. The boy would respond to questions with answers that seemed to address inquiries that had never been spoken aloud. During one particularly unsettling session, Timothy had provided detailed descriptions of Dr. Whitmore's childhood home in Boston, including rooms that the physician had not visited in decades and architectural details that no 7-year-old could possibly have known. More troubling still were Timothy's references to events that had not yet occurred. The boy would speak casually of conversations that would take place days later, describing with perfect accuracy the words and actions of individuals he had never met. Dr. Whitmore found himself trapped in a web of predetermined interactions, playing out scenes that Timothy had somehow witnessed before they transpired. The forest surrounding Blackwood had become a source of particular concern for the community's residents. Multiple witnesses reported seeing lights moving among the trees during the darkest hours of night. Not the warm glow of lanterns or torches, but a cold, blue-white illumination that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. These lights appeared to follow patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose, though their ultimate destination remained unknown. Jeremiah Caldwell had ceased his carpentry work entirely, spending his days in a state of vigilant observation that bordered on paranoia. He had begun constructing what he described as protective barriers around the family property, arrangements of iron nails, salt, and religious symbols that reflected a desperate attempt to ward off influences that defied rational explanation. Eleanor had taken to reading scripture aloud during the evening hours, though her voice carried a mechanical quality that suggested the words provided little comfort. The town's children had developed a collective aversion to certain areas of Blackwood, particularly the paths that led toward the deeper sections of forest. They would alter their routes to school and play to avoid these locations, though when questioned, they could provide no logical explanation for their behavior. Their avoidance seemed instinctual, as though some primitive survival mechanism had awakened in response to an unidentified threat. Dr. Whitmore's own mental state had begun to deteriorate under the strain of his investigation. His journal entries from this period reveal a man struggling to maintain scientific objectivity while confronting evidence that suggested the fundamental assumptions of his profession were inadequate to explain the phenomena he observed. Sleep had become elusive, filled with dreams that seemed less like products of his subconscious mind than glimpses into realities that existed parallel to his own. The month's most disturbing development occurred on December 21st, when Timothy spoke his first complete sentence in weeks. The longest night brings the deepest understanding, and understanding brings change that cannot be undone. The winter solstice of 1867 marked a turning point in Dr. Whitmore's investigation that would forever alter his understanding of the natural world. December 21st arrived with an atmospheric pressure that seemed to press down upon Blackwood like an invisible weight, creating a sense of anticipation that affected every living creature within the settlement's boundaries. Timothy's behavior on this longest night of the year departed dramatically from the patterns Dr. Whitmore had so carefully documented over the preceding months. The boy, who had maintained his unnaturally rigid schedule since the onset of his condition, abandoned all pretense of normal routine. He positioned himself at the eastern window of the Caldwell home before dawn and remained there throughout the day, his gaze fixed upon the forest with an intensity that seemed to draw the very light from the room. Dr. Whitmore had arranged to spend the solstice night at the Caldwell residence, ostensibly to monitor Timothy's condition, but increasingly driven by a compulsion he could not rationally explain. His scientific training demanded objective observation, yet he found himself swept along by currents of inevitability that seemed to emanate from the boy himself. As darkness fell, the manifestations that had plagued Blackwood for months intensified beyond anything previously recorded. The blue-white lights in the forest multiplied until the tree line resembled a constellation fallen to earth, pulsing with rhythms that seemed to correspond to some cosmic heartbeat. The temperature within the Caldwell house began to drop despite the blazing hearth, creating pockets of cold that moved through the rooms like invisible presences seeking specific destinations. Timothy's family had gathered in the main parlor, drawn together by an instinct for mutual protection that transcended conscious decision. Jeremiah clutched his Bible with hands that trembled despite his attempts to project calm authority. Eleanor had ceased her nervous movements, sitting with the stillness of prey that hopes to avoid detection by remaining motionless. Margaret and James flanked their parents, their eyes wide with the particular terror that children experience when the adults they depend upon reveal their own helplessness. The boy himself had begun to emit a barely perceptible luminescence, a pale glow that seemed to originate from beneath his skin rather than reflecting external light sources. His breathing had slowed to an almost imperceptible rhythm, and his pulse, when Dr. Whitmore dared to check it, had dropped to rates that should have indicated severe medical distress, yet seemed to cause Timothy no discomfort whatsoever. At precisely midnight, the convergence began in earnest. The lights in the forest started moving toward the Caldwell property in formations that suggested coordination and purpose. They approached through the trees with deliberate slowness, pausing at the edge of the cleared land as though awaiting some signal or permission to proceed further. Timothy rose from his position at the window with movements that flowed like liquid mercury, turning to face his family with eyes that no longer reflected any trace of childhood innocence. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate from multiple sources simultaneously, creating an effect that Dr. Whitmore would later describe as hearing the voice of a choir speaking in perfect unison. The boy's words, delivered in that unnaturally resonant tone, consisted of phrases in languages that Dr. Whitmore could not identify despite his classical education, yet somehow the meaning penetrated directly into the listener's consciousness without requiring translation. Timothy spoke of ancient agreements, of boundaries that had been maintained for centuries, and of changes that were now inevitable due to circumstances beyond human control. The forest lights had begun to pulse in synchronization with Timothy's speech, creating a visual rhythm that seemed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to some primitive part of the human brain. Dr. Whitmore found his scientific skepticism crumbling as he witnessed phenomena that demanded acknowledgement of realities his education had never prepared him to consider. As the solstice night reached its deepest point, Timothy's transformation accelerated. The luminescence beneath his skin intensified until he appeared to be lit from within by cold fire. His features, while remaining recognizably human, acquired an otherworldly quality that suggested he was becoming something that existed between categories of being. The convergence reached its climax when the forest lights suddenly extinguished, plunging the world into darkness so complete that it seemed to possess physical weight. In that absolute blackness, Dr. Whitmore heard Timothy's voice one final time, speaking words that would haunt him for the remainder of his days. The preparation is complete. The vessel is ready. Let the ancient compact be renewed. When dawn finally broke over Blackwood, it revealed a world that appeared unchanged yet felt fundamentally different, as though reality itself had shifted during the hours of darkness. The dawn that followed the winter solstice revealed a Blackwood transformed in ways that defied immediate comprehension. Dr. Whitmore awakened on the floor of the Caldwell parlor with no memory of how he had come to be there, his body stiff with cold despite the embers still glowing in the hearth. Around him, the family lay in similar positions of unconscious repose, as though they had all succumbed to some collective exhaustion during the night's events. Timothy was nowhere to be found. The search for the boy began immediately, though it proceeded with a strange reluctance that seemed to affect every participant. Jeremiah organized the men of Blackwood into search parties, yet their efforts lacked the urgency typically associated with a missing child. Instead, the searchers moved through the forest with the careful deliberation of individuals who suspected they might not wish to find what they sought. Dr. Whitmore's examination of the Caldwell house revealed subtle but unmistakable changes that suggested the previous night's events had left permanent alterations in their wake. The temperature in certain rooms remained consistently lower than others, creating microclimates that seemed to exist independently of any natural explanation. Shadows fell at angles that defied the position of the sun, and reflections in mirrors appeared slightly delayed, as though the glass were showing images from moments that had already passed. The boy's bedroom presented the most disturbing evidence of transformation. Timothy's personal belongings remained exactly as they had been arranged, yet they seemed to occupy space differently, as though the very geometry of the room had been subtly reconfigured. Dr. Whitmore's attempts to measure the chamber yielded inconsistent results. Dimensions that should have remained constant fluctuated depending upon the time of day and the position of the observer. Eleanor Caldwell had emerged from the solstice night fundamentally changed. The nervous energy that had characterized her behavior for months had been replaced by a profound stillness that mirrored her missing son's demeanor. She spoke only when directly addressed, offering responses that were factually accurate yet emotionally vacant. When questioned about Timothy's whereabouts, she would simply state that he had gone where he needed to go, as though his disappearance were a natural progression rather than a cause for alarm. The forest itself bore evidence of the previous night's convergence. Trees throughout the area surrounding Blackwood displayed patterns of frost that formed geometric designs too precise to be natural formations. These crystalline arrangements persisted despite rising temperatures, maintaining their intricate structures as though frozen by forces that operated outside normal physical laws. Dr. Hartwell's examination of the other affected families revealed a pattern of recovery that was both encouraging and deeply unsettling. The children who had exhibited sympathetic symptoms during Timothy's presence showed marked improvement in their conditions. Sleep disturbances ceased, behavioral abnormalities resolved, and the oppressive atmosphere that had plagued their households began to dissipate. Yet this improvement came at a cost that became apparent only through careful observation. Each recovered child retained subtle changes that suggested their brief connection to Timothy's condition had left permanent marks upon their development. They displayed enhanced abilities of perception and intuition that exceeded normal childhood capabilities. Yet these gifts came paired with a premature understanding of mortality and suffering that robbed them of essential innocence. They had gained knowledge that children should not possess, and this knowledge cast shadows across their young faces that would never entirely fade. The community of Blackwood itself began to adapt to its altered circumstances, with a resignation that troubled Dr. Whitmore profoundly. Residents spoke of Timothy's disappearance in past tense, as though his absence were a settled fact rather than an ongoing crisis. When pressed for explanations, They would offer vague references to old agreements and necessary sacrifices that suggested a collective understanding of events that had never been explicitly discussed. Dr. Whitmore's attempts to organize a more systematic search for Timothy met with polite but firm resistance from the townspeople. They insisted that such efforts would be futile, though they could provide no logical basis for this certainty. Their behavior suggested knowledge of the boy's fate that they were either unwilling or unable to articulate, creating an atmosphere of shared secrets that excluded the investigating physician. As January progressed, Dr. Whitmore found himself increasingly isolated within the community he had come to study. His scientific approach to understanding Timothy's case had become irrelevant in a world where the boy's transformation and subsequent disappearance were accepted as natural consequences of forces beyond human comprehension or control. The physician's journal entries from this period reveal a man struggling to reconcile his training with experiences that had shattered his fundamental assumptions about reality, leaving him adrift in a universe where the impossible had become mundane. February arrived with a thaw that seemed premature for the Massachusetts climate, bringing with it an atmosphere of unnatural warmth that left the residents of Blackwood uneasy and disoriented. Dr. Whitmore had established a makeshift research station in the abandoned schoolhouse, transforming the single-room building into a repository for his increasingly voluminous documentation of the Timothy Caldwell case. The physician's investigation had evolved beyond medical inquiry into something resembling archaeological excavation, as he sought to uncover the historical foundations that might explain the events he had witnessed. His correspondence with colleagues in Boston had yielded access to colonial records, church documents, and land surveys that painted a disturbing picture of Blackwood's past. The settlement's history revealed a pattern of unexplained disappearances that stretched back to its founding in 1692. Every generation had witnessed the vanishing of at least one child, always during the winter months, always preceded by reports of unusual behavior and atmospheric disturbances. These incidents had been carefully documented by successive town clerks, yet the records were buried so deeply within official archives that they required deliberate effort to discover. Dr. Whitmore's examination of these historical accounts revealed striking similarities to Timothy's case. Each disappeared child had exhibited the same progression of symptoms: initial fever followed by behavioral changes, periods of unnatural stillness, and an obsessive fascination with the surrounding forest. The descriptions, written in the formal language of their respective eras, painted portraits of children who had undergone transformations that their communities could neither understand nor prevent. Most disturbing were the references to what colonial documents termed the Compact of 1693. This agreement, apparently negotiated between Blackwood's founding families and unspecified entities, established terms for the settlement's continued existence in exchange for what the records euphemistically described as periodic offerings. The exact nature of these offerings was never explicitly stated, though the correlation with the pattern of disappearances suggested implications that Dr. Whitmore found deeply troubling. The physician's attempts to discuss these findings with Blackwood's current residents met with responses that ranged from polite dismissal to outright hostility. The townspeople seemed to possess an inherited understanding of their community's obligations that transcended conscious knowledge. Yet they refused to acknowledge this understanding when confronted directly. Their behavior suggested a collective agreement to maintain ignorance of truths that were simultaneously known and denied. Jeremiah Caldwell had become increasingly withdrawn following his son's disappearance, spending long hours in contemplation that bordered on catatonia. When Dr. Whitmore attempted to interview him about the family's history in Blackwood, Jeremiah would respond with fragments of information that seemed to emerge from some deeper level of consciousness. He spoke of dreams that felt more real than waking life, of voices that whispered instructions during the darkest hours of night, and of obligations that had been passed down through generations of his family. Eleanor's condition had stabilized into a state that Dr. Whitmore found more disturbing than her previous anxiety. She moved through her daily routines with mechanical precision, caring for her remaining children and maintaining her household as though Timothy had never existed. Yet, occasionally, the physician would catch her staring toward the forest with an expression of patient expectation, as though she were waiting for some predetermined signal or event. The other children in Blackwood had begun to exhibit behaviors that suggested they were unconsciously preparing for future roles in the community's hidden obligations. They played games that involved elaborate rituals of selection and sacrifice. Though they seemed unaware of the darker implications of their activities, their innocent recreation mirrored patterns that Dr. Whitmore recognized from his study of the historical records, suggesting that knowledge of the town's true nature was transmitted through means that bypassed rational instruction. Dr. Whitmore's own mental state had deteriorated under the weight of his discoveries. Sleep brought dreams that seemed to originate from sources outside his own consciousness, visions of ancient ceremonies and agreements that predated human settlement of the region. He found himself drawn to the forest during the twilight hours, following paths that seemed to appear and disappear according to some invisible schedule. The physician's journal entries from this period reveal a man caught between scientific skepticism and mounting evidence of realities that challenged the fundamental assumptions of his worldview. His documentation had become increasingly detailed and obsessive, as though precise recording might somehow provide protection against forces that operated beyond the reach of rational understanding. As February drew to a close, Dr. Whitmore made a discovery that would forever alter his perception of Timothy Caldwell's fate and his own role in the unfolding events. March arrived with an unseasonable warmth that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, as though some subterranean fire had awakened beneath Blackwood's foundations. Dr. Whitmore's discovery came not through deliberate investigation, but through accident, or what he would later question might have been carefully orchestrated inevitability disguised as chance. While organizing his research materials in the abandoned schoolhouse, the physician had noticed an irregularity in the building's floorboards. What initially appeared to be simple warping caused by moisture revealed itself, upon closer examination, to be evidence of a concealed compartment that had been sealed for decades. Within this hidden space, Dr. Whitmore discovered a collection of documents that would provide the final pieces to the puzzle he had been unconsciously assembling since his arrival in Blackwood. The papers, preserved in oiled cloth and written in multiple hands spanning nearly 2 centuries, contained detailed accounts of what their authors termed the guardianship. These documents revealed that Blackwood's founding families had not simply stumbled upon an empty wilderness, but had deliberately sought out a location where ancient boundaries between worlds had grown thin. The settlement had been established not as a refuge from civilization, but as a monitoring station for forces that required constant vigilance to contain. The Compact of 1693, Dr. Whitmore learned, had been negotiated not with human authorities, but with entities that existed in the spaces between rational understanding. These beings, described in terms that varied according to the cultural context of each writer, required periodic renewal of agreements that maintained the stability of reality itself within the region. The price of this stability was the sacrifice of children who had been marked by exposure to influences that existed beyond normal human experience. Timothy Caldwell, the documents revealed, had not been the victim of some inexplicable condition, but rather the latest in a long line of children chosen to serve as vessels for forces that required human consciousness to manifest in the physical world. His transformation had been neither random nor pathological, but the result of careful preparation that had begun before his birth. The fever that had initiated his changes had been deliberately induced through methods that the documents described in clinical detail. The physician's horror deepened as he realized that his own presence in Blackwood had not been coincidental. Dr. Hartwell's correspondence with the Massachusetts Board of Health had been carefully crafted to ensure that an investigator of Dr. Whitmore's specific qualifications would be dispatched to document Timothy's case. The boy's condition had required witness by someone capable of understanding and recording the scientific impossibilities that accompanied his transformation. More disturbing still was the revelation that Dr. Whitmore's own family history connected him to Blackwood in ways he had never suspected. His grandfather, according to the hidden documents, had been among the settlement's founding families before relocating to Boston in the early 1700s. This ancestral connection had marked the physician as a suitable observer for events that required bloodline authentication to witness fully. The documents detailed the fate that awaited Timothy following his disappearance. The boy had not died in any conventional sense, but had been transformed into something that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions of reality. His consciousness now served as a bridge between worlds, maintaining the barriers that prevented more catastrophic incursions into normal space and time. This transformation was temporary, lasting only until the next generation produced a suitable replacement, at which point Timothy would be released to whatever existence awaited beings who had transcended normal human limitations. Dr. Whitmore's investigation had been orchestrated from the beginning to serve multiple purposes. His documentation would provide future generations with the knowledge necessary to identify and prepare subsequent vessels. His medical training ensured that the scientific aspects of the transformation would be recorded with sufficient detail to guide future procedures. Most importantly, his presence had provided the final element necessary to complete Timothy's metamorphosis, a witness whose understanding could bridge the gap between rational skepticism and acceptance of impossible truths. The physician realized with growing dread that his role in Blackwood's hidden purpose was far from complete. The documents indicated that observers who had served as witnesses to the transformation process were themselves changed by the experience, developing abilities and obligations that would persist for the remainder of their lives. Dr. Whitmore had become part of the network of guardians who maintained watch over the boundaries between worlds, whether he chose to accept this responsibility or not. The final document in the collection was a letter addressed specifically to him, written in handwriting he recognized as his own despite having no memory of composing it. The letter, dated 3 months in the future, described his eventual acceptance of his role and his decision to remain in Blackwood as the community's new physician following Dr. Hartwell's planned retirement. As Dr. Whitmore read these words that he had apparently yet to write, he felt the last vestiges of his former life slipping away like sand through his fingers. The man who had arrived in Blackwood as a skeptical scientist was disappearing, replaced by someone who understood that certain truths could only be preserved through willing participation in their perpetuation. Outside the schoolhouse, the unseasonable warmth continued to rise from the earth, and in the distance, the forest waited with patient inevitability. April brought with it a transformation of Blackwood that mirrored the changes occurring within Dr. Whitmore himself. The unseasonable warmth had given way to a climate that seemed to exist independently of natural weather patterns, creating microclimates throughout the settlement that defied meteorological explanation. The physician had ceased his attempts to rationalize these phenomena, accepting them as manifestations of forces that operated according to laws he was only beginning to comprehend. Dr. Whitmore's final journal entries discovered years later by researchers investigating the mysterious disappearance of the Massachusetts Board of Health's investigative team, reveal a man who had undergone a fundamental transformation of consciousness. His scientific training had not been abandoned, but rather expanded to encompass realities that conventional medicine could neither acknowledge nor address. The physician had taken up residence permanently in Blackwood, assuming the role that the hidden documents had predicted, with an inevitability that no longer troubled him. Dr. Hartwell's retirement had proceeded exactly as the mysterious letter had foretold, leaving Dr. Whitmore as the community's sole medical practitioner and, more importantly, as the guardian of knowledge that required careful stewardship. The Caldwell family had achieved a state of equilibrium that outsiders might have mistaken for recovery. Eleanor continued her household routines with the mechanical precision that had characterized her behavior since the solstice. Yet she now displayed moments of genuine contentment that suggested acceptance of circumstances beyond her control. Jeremiah had resumed his carpentry work, though his creations now incorporated subtle design elements that served purposes unrelated to conventional furniture construction. Margaret and James had developed into children who possessed an unusual maturity that set them apart from their peers without rendering them outcasts. They understood, through means that transcended conscious instruction, that their family had been chosen for a responsibility that required sacrifice, but also conferred a form of protection that extended to the entire community. Their acceptance of this knowledge came naturally, as though they had inherited the capacity for such understanding through bloodlines that connected them to Blackwood's founding families. The forest surrounding the settlement had become a source of comfort rather than unease for Dr. Whitmore. His evening walks along paths that appeared and disappeared according to invisible schedules had revealed landscapes that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. These journeys provided him with glimpses of Timothy's current existence, not as a lost child, but as a conscious entity that maintained vigilance over boundaries that protected both Blackwood and the wider world from incursions that would prove catastrophic if left unchecked. Timothy's transformation had been completed successfully, though the boy's new form of existence defied description in conventional terms. Dr. Whitmore's encounters with his former patient occurred during states of consciousness that bordered on dream, yet possessed a clarity that exceeded normal waking awareness. In these meetings, Timothy communicated through means that bypassed language, sharing knowledge that prepared the physician for his ongoing responsibilities as guardian and observer. The cyclical nature of Blackwood's hidden purpose had become clear to Dr. Whitmore through his study of the historical records and his direct experience of the forces they described. Every generation would produce children marked for transformation, and every generation would require guardians capable of facilitating and documenting these necessary sacrifices. The physician had accepted his role in this cycle not through coercion, but through genuine understanding of the alternative consequences that would result from abandoning the ancient compact. Dr. Whitmore's correspondence with the outside world had gradually diminished until it ceased entirely, though this isolation was voluntary rather than imposed. The concerns and priorities of conventional society had become irrelevant to someone who understood the true nature of the forces that shaped human existence. His former colleagues in Boston would eventually classify him as missing, yet he remained exactly where he needed to be. The physician's final journal entry, dated April 30th, 1868, contained a single paragraph that summarized his transformation and acceptance of his new reality. "I came to Blackwood seeking to cure a child of an inexplicable condition, only to discover that the child was never ill, but rather blessed with a purpose that transcended normal human experience. In witnessing his transformation, I have undergone my own metamorphosis from skeptical observer to willing participant in mysteries that preserve the stability of existence itself." Timothy Caldwell was not lost but found, not diminished but elevated, not sacrificed but transformed into something essential for the continuation of all we hold dear. The journal concluded with a simple statement that would puzzle future researchers. The boy science couldn't explain has become the guardian that science cannot acknowledge, and in serving as witness to his transformation, I have discovered my own true purpose. Dr. Whitmore's handwriting in this final entry displayed the same unnatural precision that had characterized Timothy's penmanship during his transformation, suggesting that the cycle of change and acceptance continued to operate according to patterns established centuries before either of them had been born. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.